And there's something about people getting together over an idea and working through that idea. And even if that's just sorting materials for what you're going to do with those materials later, I just always find that that part of art making is extremely, I'm drawn to it, even though I do a lot of work, to myself on my own. It's those opportunities that I have to collaborate with people that are sometimes the most enriching.
This is Somewhere and Elsewhere, a Coastal Carolina arts podcast by Shoresides. We share and uncover stories from the artists that call coastal North Carolina home. I'm your host, Antoine Williams. Hey, what's up, folks? This is Antoine Williams. Today we have a fellow mixed media artist, which I'm really excited about that, and also a fellow educator who resides in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which actually is near Red Springs, where I'm from. And he teaches at Fayetteville State University. And I'm excited to talk to my guest today, Cornell D. Jones. What's up, man?
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty well, So before we jump in, all the stuff I want to talk to you about today, I did want to ask, so you teach at Fayetteville State University. I just wanted to ask about how has it been teaching during the pandemic?
It has been an interesting adventure, to say the least. There are students who have taken advantage of it to be like even more engaged because they have sometimes less engagement outside of the classroom. Some kids have gotten super focused, but it's been really a good experience for the most part. I also teach K-5 elementary art, which has been a different experience virtual because I've been all virtual with that one. And the kids they enjoy art that way, but they're all the time saying, "Hey, Mr. Jones, we just wish we could be back in the classroom and do everything we normally do when it comes to art." So
we run it all over the place like we normally do.
Yeah. Exactly.
I teach this semester. I'm teaching all online. It's very interesting to teach studio art course online. So I'm always interested in how this is affecting other teaching artists. So yeah, you're an artist. As I mentioned in the intro, you're a mixed media artist. And for the audience who may not know, how would you describe your artistic practice?
I'm a mixed media collage artist. I do some painting and drawing as well. I guess it would be like a blend of representational and abstract imagery to some degree. A lot of times I work small scale, and I do a lot of cutting, a lot of pasting, a lot of improvising as I work. I don't sometimes usually start out with a plan. A lot of times it's kind of intuitive, the way that I work, as far as balancing colors and patterns and in imagery and things of that nature.
Oh yeah, so that's great to hear that it's really intuitive. Yeah, I think that's such an interesting way to work. So like do you just start with material, or are you thinking about a particular ideal and you're responding to that?
Well, like if I'm working on like a specific series of something where I've already established kind of like all my visual parameters, where I go, okay, I'm going to do a certain thing for say the next 5 pieces or experimentations. Then I kind of, I gather my materials, and paint usually is the thing that comes last. But whatever clippings, sometimes it's just found papers, wallpapers, old textbooks have been making their way into the work a little bit more recently. And then hand painted stuff that I may just paint papers to get certain colors and things like that I've kind of tucked away for a while and I forget about. And I just kind of go back through that and dig. And then I use those things to kind of sort through and then put stuff together.
Do you just have like a horde of like just stuff that you collect and you can just reach back into, sort of like database of things you can pull
Oh
from?
yeah, yeah. In fact, I was going through some
Yeah.
stuff, and eventually I go, you know what? I got to either use it, or I may have to go ahead and recycle it out. But I keep. I think I've got stuff that I've had for 2, 3 plus years that when I found it, I was like, hey, this is going to be perfect for something. And I guess that particular piece hadn't made itself known yet. So I definitely keep myself a little store, a little stash of clippings and papers and things of that nature.
So, I mean, this is just based off what you're saying right now. I wonder what that is. Cause I do that too. And I think a lot of artists do that. And maybe you can describe it more. Maybe you can't, cause I don't think I can. Where you'll see something and you're like, yeah, yeah, that's going to work for something, but you can't say what. And do you think that you've developed that sort of foresight over the years? Like, could you always do that? Or are you now better equipped to saying, and it's just like your practice where you're like, I'm going to make something. I don't necessarily know what it is, but you also can look at a material and say, oh no, that can be useful. I don't know what it is yet, but I know that like I can use that.
I think some of it is just kind of that has developed over time, but definitely what I remember from childhood was a lot like that. Growing up, we would find pieces of things to put together in order to make stuff. Whether that was building a little clubhouse or a little whatever makeshift thing we were doing. And I think it's found its way into my work. It's been like that with this idea of quilting. As far as I spent a lot of time with my great grandmother, and when she quilted, it was kind of like this idea of I got a bag full of scraps, and we looked through it and found what works for us. And I think just doing that, and plus just my experiences growing up as a kid in the South, that was just kind of the natural way of making things. And we would piece things together. And in fact, it took a much longer time for me to realize that's what I was actually doing in my work. That I was finding in pieces and sitting them to the side, or I was attracted to colors and patterns and things of like that nature in order to utilize it later. And then once I did that, I was able to say, "Oh, I can identify it. This is familiar. This is what I've always done." And it seems that at that point, work began to kind of come naturally to a degree.
When did you realize that? Was it well into your professional career or before?
I think it was actually well into it because I went to graduate school, and then right after graduate school, I started teaching, and I started teaching in an after school program. And for that after school program, I was able to kind of work and teach at the same time. Then my wife and I, we moved to North Carolina, and I pretty much started teaching in the public school system, and that's pretty much all I did for a long stretch of time. And as I started to make my way back to artwork and making things, that's when I kind of really discovered that that's what I was doing. Because I was really, I guess, specific about knowing, okay, this is my time to work. This is the small time I have to set aside. And so I was really, really, it was a really narrow approach. And I was able to go back and go, oh, and reflect on how my process worked. And then I think that's when I really, really discovered that that's how it was going for me.
So, no, that's great. Yeah. I really, I'm really interested in, and I guess I can relate to this idea of just sort of always having things around and being able to pull from. And it's interesting because that was training for you in a way, right? But it was sort of still like a way of life where it's like, yeah, and plus like going to quilting, right? That's just a way of life that you're building this skill set that, as you and I are both educators, can oftentimes for some students be really hard to acquire, right? If they're just not given everything sort of like pre-cut ready for them, they have a hard time seeing it. And,
Right.
yeah. And I think like that's makes sense that you work with collage, with that. Um, Yeah, because the way you work makes me think about this essay that was written by Mary Baraka, and it's called "Hunting Isn't the Heads on the Wall." And in it, so one of the major themes of it is he talks about how, and this leads into a question. He talks about how the finished piece in and of itself isn't necessarily the most interesting thing. The finished piece is just evidence of the process of all the research, um, you know, and, and that's the interesting thing, right? So if you have 10 pieces, 10 pieces are just evidence of like all this other stuff that, that you're doing. And I know that you said that like in your work that well, a few things, right? So you talked about, well, we had talked previously, you had talked about collaboration. And I think about that in relationship to how, to the art, to that essay. And then could you talk a little bit about your ideas behind collaboration and pulling from different areas?
Yeah, and that collaboration could be, I guess, among like me and other individuals, or how the community works to certain degree. And even as I had students this semester, and some of the students that I had in a kind of like an art appreciation course were coming to art for the very first time. And we spent a whole lot of time talking about collaborative works and public art because of just the environment that we're in right now. We were seeing a lot of that. We were seeing a lot of collaborative works around social issues. So we spoke a lot about that. And there's something about people getting together over an idea and working through that idea. And even if that's just sorting materials for what you're going to do with those materials later, I just always find that that part of art making is extremely, I'm drawn to it, even though I do a lot of work, to myself on my own. It's those opportunities that I have to collaborate with people that are sometimes the most enriching even for the pieces that I work on when I'm back to myself in the studio or at the table, um, working through those visuals.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about like making art in this collaborative aspect, even if you say like just gathering material? What do you mean like in this moment? Could you like flesh that out a little bit more? Cause that's interesting.
Yeah, well, I think when like a lot of Black Lives Matter murals were being
Mm-hmm.
done, a lot of artwork in response to police brutality, in direct response to George Floyd's murder, in direct response to things that are happening over and over again. So these young people that I worked with, they weren't quite making the connection that, oh, this is art. They weren't making the dots for them, weren't completely there. And to be able to sit and have those conversations, and for them to realize, you got to think about how many people came together in that moment to make that happen, and how many people, from those that photographed it to those who came up with the designs, those who laid the paint down, those who brought the sandwiches in the water. I mean, like it's a community effort that makes something. So like you say, at the end of it, we see a piece, but ultimately it's everything, the process of that piece happening, where people are actually getting like their healing, their voices heard, their community built, because they're able to work in that space and that time together, and crossing all sorts of lines, because there just weren't one type of people participating in that moment where these things were being created and put up. In some places, just to make sure that the environment reflected something beautiful to look at, you know.
Yeah. So I often think about what do you think? And when I say your art, whether it's like collage that you make or some of the projects that you're working on, I often think about time and and how things are contextualized. And it's impossible to say with 100% certainty what anything's going to be for the most part in the future. But do you ever think about, or what do you think about, like, cause this is we're living, well, we're always living in history, but like we're living in a moment that people will study, right? And do you think about art in the context of that? Like looking back, what place do you want your art? Like, how do you want your art contextualized? Or yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Uh, I think I think I have, because then that kind of points you, it sets your compass for where you want to go, right? So if you're a person that wants to be in the canon, for example, you want to make it into the canon, then I think that's a specific direction where you have to kind of set sail. I think I have, at least into this point, decided on that for me, I am going to be a teacher artist. Like, I think there is a long history of, I guess, African American artists, especially that participate and work at HBCUs, that create work in their own right and they make beautiful work, but then they also usher other artists into making beautiful work. And to some degree, I think within just contextualizing it, uh, that's where I have found that I'm going to sit right now. I don't know if that's going to change for me in the next 5 years or 10 years, or, when uh, my work changes again. I do want to show, I do want to be included in, I guess, the history of art, but I don't find that as like my main aim, my main goal. I want to make work. I want to make as much as I can. And I want that work to have a direct line to communities that may not normally experience it face to face.
No, that's big because there's this weird thing with contemporary art where it is this idea of like you get into the canon and then somehow teaching is sort of a less, oddly enough, it's a less noble or thing to do. Like people sort of, like people sort of look down on teaching in a lot of contemporary art circles. Right. And I don't know. I find that extremely elitist and problematic in a sense. Cause a lot of, like it becomes this cult of personality. It becomes about fame. It becomes about money, and it comes about gatekeeping. And then sort of this ideal of, hey, I'm actually making this art. Yes, for myself, but a part of my practice is, developing, nurturing these younger artists. And specifically, if you're talking about HBCUs, you're talking about like the art world where, it's mostly white, right? And like most people who hold power don't look like you and I, right? And they're not from like the South or places like that. And so I feel like it's a really, I mean, do you ever think about it in that larger context of like, like what you're doing, like owning the label of artist educator? I think in 2020 is sort of like it's actually, I think it's like really unique. And you, like you're calling back to these artists that did that before.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, each time that each step of the journey for me, as far as where I've been in my career, as far as making art, even when I took time away from teaching and said, I'm going to step away from teaching just to make art, I was still teaching.
Yeah.
Even in the pursuits that I decided to, I'm going to, for a while, when I lived in Brooklyn, I worked with an organization that did murals. And I actually stopped working as a full-time teaching in the after school program so I could focus on just art making. And that led me to mural making. And it was still working with kids in groups of people, because it was a collaborative effort to get these murals up with these ideas and in different communities. And so I found that no matter what, teaching for me is wrapped up in my practice. Like they're almost wedded together. And when I do well as an artist personally, that makes my instruction more valuable. Because even if students see, oh, you can make work, they're more willing to listen if they can hear about, oh, these are the struggles and the failures that I've had as an artist. Then they're more willing to open themselves up. I don't know if you've experienced that working with students as well, but they like to hear that. They like to hear what went wrong before it went right.
No, 100%. I used to be on this kick of like, I can't show students my artwork. It's not about me. It's about them. How dare I show them my work and take away? And then I had a colleague was like, yeah, you should. It's all right. You'll be okay. Like, just show them your work. And then, yeah, once I started doing that, yeah, like it also, like I became more human to them. Like when I would
Right.
show them a work and then talk to them about, yeah, like how I got there. And I've even been in with more advanced classes, probably. I've had professors that would then show us their artwork and ask us to critique it. And I'm like, me, lowly me, the art student. And then, so yeah, I definitely include my students two parts on making the art, but with more advanced students, just being an artist. I think a lot of that is something that they don't get oftentimes in school. Just the realities of being an artist. I showed students, I'm teaching drawing, and I keep telling students, like, don't put lines in your work. You gotta like get rid of the line and value, blah, blah, blah. And I showed them a drawing I've been working on, and one student put in the chat, I see lines. And I was like, all right, cool. Thank you
Call
for
you
that.
on it.
Yeah, like real, like serious. I was like, all right. So I want to stick with teaching just for a little bit, because like you made me think of just some things. So like you say you teach at HBCU, Fayetteville State, but you also teach, you said, elementary students as well.
Yes. Yes.
Did you have black teachers growing up, or black male teachers growing up?
I can think of three I've had. Those three that I've had were, I think, elementary. I remember I was a PE teacher. I think his name was Coach Lang. Then my track coach in high school, Coach King, who was also my driver's ed instructor. And then I had one other, Mr. Curtis was my shop teacher in sixth and seventh grade. So those three over time, which seems like a lot for students, even compared to these days.
Right.
But those three, I remember those three. Yeah.
Do you see, and I don't know, so I know obviously like Fayetteville State is, it's HBCU, but what does it mean to you to be a black male teacher teaching students? And this is something that, we normally don't see, especially in elementary, spaces, K through 6, K through 12, in the arts. Also in academia, right? You don't always see that in the arts, right? You don't see us that much. What does it mean anything to you? Was there a moment that stood out?
It's weird because I rarely think about it, just because I've been doing it for so long. Like it's just me, and I'm in the space. And sometimes I tend to not think about that, kind of like who I am in this space, after doing it year after year after year. But occasionally I am reminded that this is not the norm. When we have huge area meetings and I look around, it's like, oh, okay, no, there's like two of us, as far as that. Then it goes, oh man. But then I think about in the classroom when I may be teaching a group and there's 4 or 5, 6 or 7, black boys that have it, and I go, well, man, there were at least 5 or 6 that had it when I was in the classroom and had it much more than I did. So, I mean, I think about it in terms of a lot of times when other people bring it to my attention, I do know that there is a value to it, and there is definitely in it. They see themselves in me, and I know that they see themselves in me. And I've had parents approach me and talk to me about it, and it's usually at those moments that I'm reminded, like, oh, okay. Otherwise, it's just kind of head down doing the work, every day.
Definitely. So in your artist statement, you said, I follow ideals. Could you expand on that for us?
Yeah. It's, how I guess as an artist, I'll get an idea. I have an idea and I don't want to, I'll put it this way. Like, if I see a bird that I like, oh man, that bird moves me to do a drawing. then maybe I want to do 10 or 15 pen drawings of birds, in that moment. Or if there is a collage to work on, or if there is a figurative piece that I want to do. So whatever the idea is for me is kind of like the thing that I like to follow, because then that path leads me to whatever experience I'm going to have with the artwork. So it rather than saying I am going to just do collages, or I'm going to do paintings, or I'm going to do acrylic painting or watercolor painting, I say I follow the idea and then incorporate whatever materials become necessary to kind of go down that path with that idea.
Definitely. So on CornellDJones.com, there's a series of 15 small, I'm going to call them collage portraits. You might call them something else. Could you talk to us a little bit about the ideals behind those?
Yeah, that series of works are kind of inspired by a quilt that I actually have from my great grandmother, and I was looking for a way into doing some works a few years ago, and I had this quilt, and I kept looking at it and just remembering and reflecting on how we made it, the time that I spent with her. It Those pieces grew out of that. Even some of the color palette or on some of them directly from that quilt that we put together. So those pieces grew out of that. The silhouette I've used it a lot in my artwork when I want to kind of present this idea of there, not there, a presence, a familiar. I use it, and it also is something that I can do repeatedly over and over again. And then I don't have to think about, well, what comes next? It's just, okay, here's my idea, and let's just go with it for the next 15 or 20 things to see what happens. So that's really where it grew out of, that particular series of works.
Oh, it's wild that you said that because I had written down that your work sort of reminds me of Kara Walker and Mayor Bearden and a little bit of Benny Andrews, that series. And I wrote down silhouette and, and I'm thinking about like black people, like I see them as black people, right? And as black people as a whole, not as maybe one particular individual. And so you're talking about the seen and not seen, and just this idea of like black people really being like we're there, but not really. Or there's this interplay of that. So it's really, really interesting that that's what you were thinking about. I want to go back a bit to, like, you were talking about I think like your great grandmother. And so it's really interesting. I think that this series is referencing a quilt. And now that you say that, I can definitely see it, like the quilt in there. But I'm thinking about this piece as an archive in a sense, right? So I've just been thinking about lately about archives and housing information and histories. And there's so much history within like black communities that are lost, right? And so like this skill that you develop with your grandmother, that one probably, most people wouldn't view as a skill, that you developed, but that was passed down through your grandmother. And like, I look at the piece as an archive of maybe her as a person, but her as her skill set and her as an artist. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it was in doing those, it became kind of a portrait of her, for me. And whenever I exhibited those pieces, I always do a small installation that involves the quilt, a chair, a coffee table, kind of sorts, and like items that were like symbols of her for me. And that small installation is kind of like her portrait within this larger like portrait of how she, or the time that we spent together. So it's always interesting when I do exhibit those and people come and they respond to it, and whatever they get from it, I'm always interested in hearing, because as always, people get different things from the pieces that you make, right? So those particular pieces that they look at, I have people say, oh, that looks like, that reminds me of, this, an aunt or my grandmother, or and so it has, I think, that personal history, but that's a shared history. among people. But it's definitely like what you say. It's definitely a portrait of her, and it was kind of like, I wouldn't say an homage, but a way of me honoring what she gave to me in terms of time spent. And I was also like working at mining my own personal imagery and history and how that would play out through pieces. And that's how it played out for me.
Oh yeah, that's great. So I got one more question before we head out. I think I asked everybody this. I'm asking everybody this, but like I said, we're living in history, right? You have a global pandemic unlike we've ever seen. We've had uprising around George Floyd, around Taylor. We just had an election. Where I guess you could say we saved democracy. Like, what does it mean for you to make art in this moment? To be in the South, to be Black, to be a Black artist, or an artist who is Black, in this moment?
I think first and kind of like foremost is to continue to express that I'm human, that in being human, that desire, that need, that want to create and make the space around you more beautiful, more just, more right. That in making the work and making the connections with people and talking about these concepts and things like that, uh, that's what I would say the most. And it's that it's an expression, not necessarily an expression of like the times, but an expression of the fact that I'm still here. There's more to come, and there's more than what is kind of like around me, to me and to others. And making work is that for me, because eventually when things pass and new things come along, there'll be a different response to those things. So I just find that I keep making work, and even when when kind of like the moment has gotten me kind of so beat down to where I'm like, there's nothing right now that I want to reflect. That being able to participate in that for me is just that, like, that basic creator need, that response to say, you know what, there is some contribution that I can make, whether that's into people or into the objects that I make, that can quite possibly be a bright light or a pinhole of light somewhere in this thing that we're kind of in, this moment that we're living in, or experience that we're having.
Great. Cornell D. Jones, appreciate you, brother, coming through and chopping it up with us today. Thanks.
Oh, thank you.
You've been listening to Somewhere and Elsewhere by Shoresides. Know of an artist you think we should cover? Contact us at info@shoresides.org or visit shoresides.org to learn more about our work. I'm Antoine Williams. Thank you for listening.